On Christmas Eve, a tired waitress named Leah accepted a seat she hadn't earned by status, only by sweat, and held her posture as if dignity were a coat she could button against the cold. She did it for an honor, someone promised her, never knowing it was designed as a joke with witnesses. And she certainly didn't know the empty chair across from her would become the stage for a reckoning, because the boy who would soon look at her with innocent certainty was the billionaire's son, about to set a new price on what kindness is worth. The luxury restaurant hummed with soft laughter and polished music, and the warm lights worked hard to make everything look gentle, even cruelty. Garlands draped the walls like borrowed joy, and crystal glasses caught the glow like little mirrors of privilege. Leah told herself it was only for a moment, only for one night, because hope can be foolish and still feel necessary. But when she sat down in her red uniform, the room did not see a guest. It saw a story it wanted to mock. At first, she waited the way working people wait for everything, quietly, obediently, trying not to take up space. A slice of pizza arrived as if it were a gift, yet it landed in front of her like a punchline, and the corners of the room tightened with contained amusement. Phones rose with practiced ease, not to preserve a memory, but to capture a humiliation, and Leah felt the strange heat of being watched without being valued. The chair across from her stayed empty, and that emptiness began to speak louder than any words. What Leah did next wasn't about romance, and it wasn't about money. It was about the stubborn decision to remain human when others tried to turn her into entertainment. She kept her hands steady, lifted her eyes, and refused to plead for mercy from people who enjoyed withholding it. She had no idea that this small act, simply staying seated, simply not collapsing, would become the moment that exposed the character of everyone in the room. Because the true test of power is never what it can purchase, but what it chooses to protect. Then the doors opened, and the restaurant changed its tone as if someone had lowered the volume on arrogance. A billionaire stepped inside with the calm authority of a man used to being obeyed, holding the hand of a small boy whose gaze moved freely, untrained in cruelty. Leah's heart tightened, certain this was the final scene of her embarrassment, the final approval stamp on the joke. But the child pointed at her clear and loud and said, "I like her," and the room went still, waiting to see whether a father would defend the spectacle or defend the goodness his own son could already recognize. The boy's declaration did not sound like a compliment tossed into the air. It sounded like a verdict delivered by the only person in the room who still believed goodness was simple. Leah felt the silence arrive in waves, first as shock, then as embarrassment, then as something sharper, like the crowd had been caught with its hands in the act. She kept her chin level, not because she felt brave, but because she had learned that if you give cruel people a crack, they will widen it until you disappear inside it. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and she waited for the billionaire to look at her the way the others had looked at her, as if her presence were a mistake that needed correcting. But the child's steady gaze pinned the moment in place, forcing every adult to confront what they were about to do next. Around her, the restaurant's elegance suddenly seemed like a costume the room could no longer wear convincingly. The warm lights still shone, the garlands still glimmered, and the polished glassware still flashed like little trophies, yet none of it could soften the cruelty that had been arranged so casually. Phones hovered in uncertain hands, some lowering as if embarrassed by their own enthusiasm, others staying raised because humiliation is addictive when it isn't yours. Leah could feel eyes scraping over her uniform, her posture, the pizza she hadn't asked for, searching for some detail to justify the laughter again. The empty chair across from her looked less like a missing guest now, and more like proof. Proof that the night had been designed to make her hope and then punish her for hoping. Richard Sterling stood near the entrance with the quiet authority of a man who rarely walks into rooms without rearranging them. No one told him to speak softly, yet the entire place fell into that careful hush reserved for wealth and consequence. His gaze moved over the tables, not lingering on the decorations, but on the faces, the ones pretending innocence, the ones already crafting explanations, the ones waiting to see which way power would lean. When his eyes finally settled on Leah, she felt the old instinct to apologize for existing, even though she had done nothing but accept an invitation meant to trick her. There was calculation in his expression, but there was also something else, a tightening around the eyes, as if he were seeing the ugliness of his world with sudden clarity and disliking what it revealed. It was the look of a man who had been asked a question no contract could answer. Ben's hand remained curled around his father's, small and insistent, as if he were holding Richard in place so he couldn't escape into excuses. The boy stared at Leah with uncomplicated certainty, not the stare of curiosity that treats a working person like a novelty, but the steady attention of someone who notices what matters. Leah realized with a strange ache that he wasn't admiring her uniform or her obedience. He was responding to the one thing she had tried to keep intact all night, her dignity. That recognition, coming from a child, felt both soothing and painful because it exposed how rarely adults offered it without conditions. For a moment, Leah imagined what it must be like to grow up in a world where people say what they mean and mean what is kind, and the thought almost made her knees weak beneath the table. The manager finally hurried forward with a smile that was too practiced to be honest, as if a polished expression could wipe away what the room had enjoyed moments earlier. Someone offered the word prank like a shield, and another called it holiday fun, the way people soften cruelty by wrapping it in celebration. Leah waited for Richard Sterling to accept the easy story, to laugh politely, to protect the comfort of the wealthy, and leave her to carry the embarrassment alone, because that was how the world usually worked. Instead, his eyes drifted to the phones, then to the empty chair, and then back to Leah, and the air around him changed, less amused, more deliberate, like a door closing on tolerance. Leah felt it before he said anything at all. Whatever happened next would not be a continuation of their joke, but the beginning of a consequence. Leah's life had never collapsed in one dramatic moment. It thinned out slowly, like fabric worn down by daily use. She measured time in shifts and bus schedules, in the weight of an apron damp from dishwater, in the careful arithmetic of rent, utilities and groceries that never quite balanced. People like her didn't get sudden miracles, only brief reprieves, an extra $10 in tips, a manager who wasn't angry, a customer who remembered to say thank you. She had learned to keep her hopes small because big hopes had sharp edges, and when they broke, they cut deep. Even Christmas, once a season of warmth and music, had become something practical. Overtime, pay, tired feet, and the quiet ache of watching other people celebrate what she couldn't afford. There had been a time, years earlier, when she believed her life might expand instead of shrink. Back then, she still owned a second pair of shoes that weren't for work, and she still kept a notebook of small dreams. Community college classes, a modest apartment with sunlight, a little emergency fund that meant she could breathe. But adulthood arrived like a bill slid across the table, and it demanded payment in ways no one had taught her to prepare for. Her mother's absence, her father's decline, the sudden responsibility of being the steady one, each thing added a stone to her pockets until the simplest days felt heavy. She did not resent hard work. She resented how invisible hard work could make a person, as if effort itself were a kind of silence. And yet, Leah still carried a stubborn tenderness that the world hadn't managed to beat out of her. She saved day-old bread for the elderly man who waited outside the subway with trembling hands, and she learned the names of lonely regulars who stayed longer than their coffee because home felt too empty. She kept her voice gentle with new hires, who were terrified of making mistakes because she remembered what it was like to feel small in a big room. Kindness, for her, wasn't a performance. It was a habit, formed the same way endurance is formed, through repetition when no one applauds. That was why the message about the special blind date struck her the way it did, not like romance, but like acknowledgement, as if the world had finally noticed she was trying. She had received it on her break, under fluorescent lights that made everyone look tired, her phone buzzing against the thin fabric of her pocket. The words were polished and sweet, calling her chosen, promising she would be honored for her service, telling her to come as she was because the surprise was meant to celebrate authenticity. Leah reread it 3 times, letting herself imagine the smallest, safest version of hope, a free meal, a kind conversation, a moment where she didn't feel like background noise. But then her eyes caught the sender's name at the bottom, and something cold moved through her stomach because it wasn't a random number or an anonymous account. It was a name she hadn't heard in years, a name tied to an event she had tried to bury under work and exhaustion, Cassandra Vale. Leah sat very still in the staff hallway, the roar of the kitchen suddenly distant, as if she were hearing it from underwater. Cassandra Vale had been there the night Leah's life quietly changed, the night a charity gala turned strange behind velvet curtains, the night Leah saw a woman crying in a service corridor and a man's shadow blocking the light. Leah had never told anyone what she witnessed, partly because no one had asked, and partly because she had understood instinctively that poor people are not believed when they speak about the powerful. Now, with the restaurant's humiliation still burning on her skin and her phone glowing in her palm, she stared at that familiar name and felt the past rise up, alive and unfinished, because the invitation hadn't been a prank chosen at random at all. When Leah lifted her eyes again, the restaurant no longer felt like a dining room. It felt like a courtroom where the wealthy had rehearsed the verdict and forgotten the defendant could hear. Richard Sterling still hadn't spoken, yet his presence had already rewritten the rules everyone thought they lived by, because suddenly the prank no longer belonged to the people who planned it. The manager hovered nearby with a smile stretched too thin, ready to offer excuses like napkins, ready to wipe away the scene before it stained the night. Leah could sense the crowd deciding in real time which version of the story would be safest to repeat tomorrow. And in the middle of it all, Ben stood with the earnest calm of a child who didn't know he had just dared an entire room to be better. Richard's gaze moved again, slower this time, sweeping over the phones as if each glowing screen were an accusation. He didn't ask Leah what she had done to cause this, and that alone felt like a small mercy, because she was used to being blamed for other people's cruelty. He asked one simple question, quiet, controlled but sharp enough to cut through performance, about why a waitress was seated alone like a spectacle in a restaurant that prided itself on class. The manager began to speak quickly, too quickly, offering phrases that sounded polished and harmless, the way people talk when they want a wrong to sound like a misunderstanding. Leah watched Richard's face as the excuses spilled out, and she realized something unsettling. He understood those tactics intimately because he had lived his life among them. Power, she saw, was not always loud. Sometimes it was the ability to decide what truth would survive the night. Ben tugged gently at his father's hand, not begging, not pleading, just insisting on attention the way children insist on what they believe is right. He stepped closer to Leah's table and looked at the pizza in front of her, with the practical curiosity of a child who doesn't understand why adults make things complicated. Leah forced a small smile for him, and it felt strange on her face, as if she were wearing it after years of keeping it folded away. Richard noticed that smile, noticed how carefully she offered it despite the humiliation still clinging to her like smoke. and Leah saw a flicker of discomfort move across him. It wasn't pity. Pity would have been easy and shallow. It was the discomfort of realizing someone had been hurt inside a world he controlled. And that discomfort, she sensed, was dangerous to the people who relied on him staying indifferent. Then, from a table near the center of the room, a woman rose with the smooth confidence of someone who had never been asked to explain herself. Cassandra Vale wore elegance the way others wore uniforms, and her smile was warm enough to look kind, while her eyes remained cold and measuring. Leah felt her stomach tighten at the sight of her, because memories returned not as pictures, but as sensations, dim corridors, hushed voices, the feeling of seeing something that could cost you if you admitted it. Cassandra's voice carried easily, wrapping the situation in sweetness, calling it a miscommunication, an attempt at a holiday surprise, as if the cruelty had simply stumbled by accident into Leah's life. Richard listened without interrupting, but Leah could see the line of his jaw harden because the room wasn't watching Cassandra, it was watching him. And Cassandra, with that practiced poise, was quietly reminding him that his reputation lived inside her world too. Richard finally shifted his weight and asked Leah directly what she had been told. No softness, but no contempt either, only a firm invitation for the truth to stand on its own feet. Leah's voice threatened to fail her, yet she spoke anyway, explaining the message, the promise of honor, the empty chair, the phones, the laughter that tried to turn her into a holiday joke. As she mentioned Cassandra's name, she watched Richard's eyes change, as if a door inside him had just closed on trust, and Ben looked up at his father with a seriousness that didn't belong in a child's face. The restaurant waited for Richard to choose whether this would become another neatly buried incident, or the beginning of something that could not be managed with money. And Leah realized, with a quiet surge of fear, that the truth she carried might be worth more than she could afford to reveal. The moment Leah spoke Cassandra's name, the room seemed to split into two kinds of people. Those who suddenly remembered their manners, and those who doubled down on cruelty behind polite smiles. Cassandra didn't flinch. She only softened her expression, as if concern were a perfume she could spray over the situation until it smelled acceptable again. She apologized in the way the powerful apologize, without admitting harm, calling it a holiday misunderstanding, and insisting the intention had been to celebrate the staff. Around her, a few guests laughed lightly, eager to restore the old rhythm, to make Leah's humiliation feel harmless again. Leah realized then that the prank wasn't merely a joke, it was a ritual meant to remind her where she belonged. The manager seized that opening like a man grabbing a lifeline, stepping forward with his palms raised as though he were the true victim of chaos. He explained that Leah had taken things personally, that she'd misread the invitation, that the restaurant had only wanted to include her, as if inclusion were something that could be offered with a smirk and revoked with a shrug. A woman at a nearby table commented on Leah's uniform with a small, delicate laugh, the kind that pretends to be harmless while it draws blood, and someone else murmured that staff should stay professional. Leah felt her stomach tighten because she understood the trap. If she defended herself, she would be accused of causing a scene. If she stayed silent, the lie would become the official version of the night. Richard Sterling listened without moving, yet the stillness around him grew heavier, like a storm, waiting to decide where to break. Leah could see he was weighing forces that had nothing to do with truth. Alliances, reputations, the invisible economy of social debts. Cassandra watched him closely, not with affection, but with the quiet confidence of someone who believed she knew what he would choose when pressed. Leah had seen that look before, years ago, when people with polished voices spoke in corridors and expected the world to obey them. The most painful part was how familiar it all felt. power turning reality into something convenient and daring the vulnerable to call it a lie. Ben, however, refused to participate in the adult's careful dishonesty. He stepped closer to Leah's table as if closeness were protection, and his small face tightened with confusion when he sensed the room trying to make her the problem. Leah offered him a gentle smile, not because she felt safe, but because she recognized a rare moment to keep something pure from being stained. Richard's attention flickered to his son, and for a heartbeat his composure cracked, revealing something that looked almost like shame, because children don't care about status, and their judgments do not accept bribes. Leah saw then that Ben's simple loyalty was becoming a kind of pressure Richard had never learned to resist, a moral weight pressing against a lifetime of polished control. When the manager finally suggested softly but clearly that Leah should return to work and stop distracting the guests, it felt like the first true wound of the night, proof that the system would rather punish her than admit what it had done. Cassandra's smile held steady, as if she were offering Richard a graceful exit from responsibility, and several guests leaned back in relief, already tasting the comfort of getting away with it. Leah's hands curled beneath the table, nails biting her palms, because she could feel her job teetering on the edge of someone else's amusement. Richard's gaze moved from Leah to the empty chair, then to the phones still glowing in the dim light, and his voice, when it finally came, was calm enough to sound merciful, yet firm enough to make the room go rigid, as if everyone knew the next sentence would decide who was protected and who was sacrificed. Richard Sterling's voice did not rise, yet it altered the temperature of the room, the way a storm alters the sea, quietly, decisively, leaving no doubt about which direction things would move. He asked for an explanation that did not hide behind festive language, and the manager's smile began to wobble at the corners, because polished excuses only work when the powerful agree to be comforted by them. Leah watched the guests adjust their faces, sympathy appearing where amusement had been, restraint replacing mockery, because status teaches people how to survive their own shame. Cassandra Vale remained composed, her expression still soft, as if she were offering Richard a dignified path back to silence, and Leah could feel it. The room was no longer judging her, it was judging him, waiting to see whether he would protect the truth or protect the illusion. The phones were still there, of course, though many had lowered, and their dim screens became a different kind of accusation, proof that cruelty could be staged and preserved as easily as a holiday toast. Leah felt the familiar pressure of being the easiest person to blame, the simplest sacrifice to restore everyone else's comfort, because the poor are often treated as the price of keeping peace. She could almost hear tomorrow's version of the story forming in the air, that she overreacted, that she misunderstood, that she should have been grateful for any attention at all. Pride, she realized, is not only personal, it can be collective. A room full of people refusing to admit they did something ugly because admitting it would make them smaller. And in that moment, Leah understood that her silence had always been the fuel that kept their pride burning clean. Ben, standing near her table, watched his father with a seriousness that made him look older than he was, as if he sensed that grown-ups were choosing between two kinds of truth. Leah kept her expression gentle for him, even as her stomach knotted, because she could not bear to see a child learn that kindness is punished when it disrupts power. Richard's attention kept flickering toward his son, and that flicker mattered, because it revealed the one force in the room that did not negotiate. A child's admiration is not bought, it is earned, and once lost, it leaves a hollow no fortune fills. Leah saw Richard's pride tighten, not as arrogance, but as resistance. The resistance of a man who had spent his life controlling outcomes, and now faced an outcome he could not control without betraying his own child. Cassandra stepped closer, her tone still smooth, her words still wrapped in courtesy, and she offered Richard the kind of solution the wealthy prefer: discreet damage control, a quiet apology, a gentle dismissal of the staff member who had become a complication. She spoke as if Leah were an inconvenience rather than a person, as if the simplest way to cleanse the night was to remove the evidence that anyone had suffered. The manager nodded too quickly, eager to be rescued by the familiar method of making the vulnerable disappear. Leah's throat tightened, because she recognized that method from every workplace and every landlord's office and every conversation where her needs had been treated as negotiable. And she could tell Cassandra was not improvising. This was a pattern, a practiced way of ending stories before they become inconvenient. Richard did not accept the offer right away, but his silence carried its own threat, because it meant he was still weighing what mattered more: his image among people like Cassandra, or the moral clarity his son had placed in his hands. Leah felt the room lean toward the outcome it wanted, the easy outcome, the one that kept privilege undisturbed, and she braced herself for the familiar ache of being discarded. Yet when Richard finally turned fully toward the manager, his gaze steady and cold, Leah sensed something shift, something that suggested this might not end with her being sent back to the kitchen in shame. And as Ben's small fingers tightened around his father's hand, Leah realized the next choice Richard made would either teach his son what kindness costs, or teach him that kindness is worth defending. The decision came the way these things always come for people like Leah, not with shouting, but with procedure dressed up as professionalism. The manager straightened his tie, cleared his throat, and spoke with the careful tone of someone who had rehearsed how to sound reasonable while doing something cruel. He said Leah had disrupted the dining room, that she had embarrassed the establishment, that she needed to clock out immediately and leave the premises before she caused further issues. Around them, the guests exhaled in relief, because consequences, when aimed at the poor, feel like order being restored. Leah looked at Richard Sterling, searching for a sign that power would finally choose protection over convenience. But the room moved faster than his conscience could speak. Cassandra Vale stepped in like a well-dressed verdict, her voice velvet soft as she offered the manager a narrative that would keep everyone comfortable. She talked about misunderstandings and sensitivity, about how hard-working staff sometimes misinterpret kindness, the way one might excuse a child for breaking something expensive. Then, almost casually, she planted the kind of suggestion that doesn't need evidence to do damage. That perhaps Leah had been angling for attention, that perhaps she had been trying to get something she didn't earn, that perhaps this wasn't the first time she'd made a scene. Leah felt the accusation slither under her skin, because she knew how quickly suspicion sticks to a uniform. In that moment, she understood the real design of the prank. It wasn't only to laugh at her, it was to make her easier to discard afterward. Two staff members approached as if escorting her were a routine, their faces apologetic in the way employees look when they are told to enforce injustice to keep their own jobs. Leah stood slowly, her knees unsteady, and she placed the untouched pizza down as if it were evidence she didn't want to carry. She tried to speak, tried to explain that she'd been invited, that she had followed instructions, that she had only wanted one night to feel seen, but her words hit the wall of the room's impatience. The wealthy guests looked away, suddenly fascinated by napkins and glasses, because denial is easier when you don't meet the victim's eyes. Even the Christmas lights felt cruel now, sparkling above her like decoration on a lie. As she was guided toward the entrance, Leah heard Ben's voice behind her, small but urgent, repeating her name the way a prayer repeats what it cannot afford to lose. She turned just enough to see him straining against his father's hand, his face crumpled with confusion, as he watched adults push away the one person he had decided was good. Richard's posture tightened, his jaw set as if he were forcing himself to remain composed, but Leah could see panic trying to break through the polished surface. For an instant, Leah thought Richard might stop it, might finally say no, might finally pull the room back into decency. But the manager kept moving her forward, and the door's cold draft promised an ending the room would find convenient. Leah stepped into the lobby with her heart pounding, feeling the weight of losing not just dignity, but her job, her stability, her fragile hope. Outside, winter struck her face like punishment, the night air sharp with snow and exhaust, and she hugged her thin coat tighter, as if fabric could hold her life together. She took 3 steps away from the restaurant, trying not to cry, trying to keep her breathing quiet, trying to tell herself she would survive this the way she had survived everything else, one painful hour at a time. Then she heard the door behind her burst open, followed by fast, light footsteps that did not belong in the street. Leah turned, and in the glow spilling from the entrance, she saw Ben, alone, running toward her through the falling snow, while the sound of his father's voice rose behind him in sudden terror. For a few heartbeats, Leah could only stare as Ben ran toward her through the falling snow, his small shoes slipping on the wet pavement, while the bright doorway behind him framed the panic he didn't yet understand. Instinct moved faster than fear. She stepped forward and dropped to one knee, opening her arms the way you open a door in an emergency, not thinking about the humiliation still clinging to her, not thinking about the job she had just lost. Ben crashed into her like a frightened sparrow, clinging to her coat, and Leah wrapped him up, shielding him from the cold and the street and the sharpness of the night. She could hear Richard Sterling's voice now, urgent, unpolished, stripped of its usual command, as he closed the distance with long strides, calling his son's name as if it were the only wealth that mattered. When Richard reached them, his breath came hard in the winter air, and the sight of Ben, safe in Leah's arms, seemed to undo him in a way the dining room never could. He didn't touch Leah at first, as if he didn't know whether he was allowed, but his hands hovered, shaking with the kind of fear that doesn't belong to men who believe they control outcomes. "Ben," he whispered, and the boy finally looked up at him with stubborn certainty, still holding Leah like a decision he meant to keep. Leah felt the irony sting, how quickly the world had tried to throw her away, and how quickly it now depended on her steadiness to fix what pride had broken. Richard's eyes lifted to hers, and in them she saw something that wasn't charity and wasn't romance, but a startled recognition that goodness can appear in the places the powerful least expect to find it. Back inside, the restaurant's warmth felt false, like heat borrowed from a lie, and the guests watched the return as if the night had become a different kind of performance. The manager rushed forward with apologies that tasted like self-preservation, and Cassandra Vale smiled with the same careful calm, as if even a child running into the snow could be folded into a story that protected her. Richard did not indulge them. He spoke quietly to his assistant, issued short instructions, and the room began to understand that the easy ending was slipping away, not because Leah had demanded justice, but because Ben had. Leah stood near the entrance with her fingers numb and her heart racing, watching power rearrange itself in real time, and she realized that consequences, real consequences, rarely arrive with fireworks. They arrive with decisions made in a tone so calm it leaves no place to argue. Still, calm decisions did not repair what had been done to her, and when Richard's staff offered to drive her home, Leah refused with a small shake of her head that surprised even her. She could not bear another ride in someone else's control, another moment where she looked like a charity case being escorted out of trouble. She walked instead, the cold biting through her sleeves, her mind replaying the scene like a bruise you keep pressing just to prove it's real. She thought of the laughter, the phones, the empty chair, and the way the manager's professional voice had stripped her job from her as neatly as clearing a table. By the time she reached her apartment, her legs ached and her pride ached more, and she wondered if the worst part of humiliation was the event itself, or the way it teaches you to distrust every good thing that tries to follow. In her small kitchen, with the weak heater rattling like it was arguing with winter, Leah sat at the table and let the silence settle around her, the way it always did after a long shift. She told herself she should have known better than to believe in a special honor, because hope, when you've been overlooked for too long, can start to feel like a form of stupidity. Yet Ben's voice, clear, certain, kept returning to her, and it confused her because it sounded like truth without agenda, kindness without calculation. She pressed her palms to her eyes and tried to pray, not for revenge and not for riches, but for the strength to wake up tomorrow and keep going, even if the world had decided she was disposable. And somewhere beneath the exhaustion, another thought quietly refused to leave her alone. If a child could see her worth in a room full of adults who chose cruelty, then maybe this story wasn't over. Maybe it was only beginning, and the next knock on her door would come from a world that suddenly needed her honesty more than it wanted her silence. The next morning arrived without ceremony. Grey light sliding through Leah's thin curtains, as if the day itself were unsure it should intrude. Her body moved on habit, kettle, sink, a stare at the calendar she never truly followed, yet her mind kept returning to the restaurant, to the empty chair, to the cold air that had slapped her face when she stepped outside. She told herself she needed to focus on practical things now, how to replace a paycheck, how to explain the sudden termination on her next application, how to keep her landlord from noticing weakness. Still, there was a lingering sensation she couldn't dismiss, like a handprint on the soul, because the shame of being laughed at does not end when the laughter stops. It follows you into quiet rooms and sits beside you like an unwanted guest. Her phone rang just as she was convincing herself that the world had already moved on. The number was unfamiliar, and for a moment she considered letting it fade into silence, because unknown calls rarely meant anything good to someone who lived paycheck to paycheck. But something in her, fatigue, instinct, or the stubborn part that had refused to collapse at that table, made her answer. A woman's voice met her, calm and careful, not bright like customer service and not sharp like a manager delivering bad news, but steady in the way of someone who has spent years cleaning up after other people's pride. She introduced herself as Maribel, speaking on behalf of Mr. Sterling's household, and asked gently if Leah was safe, as if safety was something that could be checked on like a neighbor's light. Leah's first reaction was suspicion, because the wealthy rarely reach out without a reason that serves them. Yet Maribel didn't ask Leah to sign anything, didn't hint at threats, didn't try to reshape the story. She only asked what happened in Leah's own words, and then listened without interrupting. Leah heard herself speaking more than she expected, about the message that called her chosen, about Cassandra's name, about the phones rising like they were hungry, about the manager's voice stripping her job away while the room pretended it was normal. She did not dramatize it. She didn't have to, because humiliation is already dramatic in its own quiet brutality. When she finished, there was a pause on the line, and Leah could sense Maribel holding something back, as if the truth had become too heavy to carry alone. Then Maribel told her why she was calling, and the reason did not sound like romance or charity. It sounded like consequence. She said Ben had cried himself hoarse after the incident, not because he was frightened of the snow, but because he could not understand why adults were allowed to be cruel when it was so clearly wrong. He had asked again and again where Leah was, whether she was cold, whether she was sad, whether someone had apologized to her, and when no answer satisfied him, he had insisted he wanted to see her. Maribel's voice softened when she added that the boy had called Leah the good lady, as if goodness were a title more important than wealth. Leah felt a pressure build behind her eyes, because she was not used to being missed, not used to someone caring what happened to her after she walked out of a room. Maribel didn't promise miracles. She offered something simpler and, to Leah, more startling, an invitation to be heard in a place where people usually spoke over her. Mr. Sterling wanted to meet privately, she said, and he wanted Leah to tell him everything, not for entertainment and not for appearances, but because Ben had forced a question into his father's life that would not go away. Leah stared at her chipped kitchen table, at the weak sunlight on the linoleum, and felt fear and hope tangled together until she couldn't tell which one was stronger. She knew stepping into a billionaire's world again could bring more humiliation, more manipulation, even danger, especially with Cassandra Vale's name circling the story like a shadow. But as she held the phone and listened to Maribel's quiet sincerity, Leah realized that this call was not asking her to be small. It was asking her for once to stand in the truth, and she could not shake the feeling that the next door she opened might lead to justice, or to the very secret Cassandra had been trying to bury. Leah almost didn't go. She stood in front of her small mirror for a long time, not because she had many choices, but because she understood what it meant to step into a powerful man's world on his terms. She wore her simplest coat, brushed her hair back, and kept her hands busy. Keys, phone, a folded bill in her pocket, because stillness invited fear to speak too loudly. The invitation felt unreal, the way sudden opportunities often feel to people who have spent years being overlooked, and she kept waiting for the catch to reveal itself. Yet beneath the doubt, there was a quieter pull, a sense that last night had opened something that could not be shut again without damage. If the world had already decided to make a story out of her, she wanted, just once, to tell it in her own words. The car that arrived for her was not flashy, but it was unmistakably expensive in the way it moved. Smooth, silent, patient. The driver spoke gently, addressed her with respect, and that alone unsettled her because respect without conditions felt unfamiliar, like stepping into warm water after living in cold. As the city passed outside the window, Leah watched neighborhoods change the way social rules change, as if the streets themselves carried invisible borders. She thought about the restaurant, the laughter, the phones, and the manager's calm cruelty, and she wondered if this meeting would simply be another room where powerful people decided what her pain would be called. But then she remembered Ben's voice, clear, certain, and she held onto it like a candle sheltered from wind. A child had seen her as good. Now she was about to find out what a billionaire did with that kind of truth. Sterling's home was not the kind of mansion that shouted. It was the kind that didn't need to. The gates opened with quiet permission, and the driveway curved through winter trees wrapped in tasteful lights, as if even Christmas here was curated. Inside, the warmth smelled like polished wood and clean linen, the kind of comfort that doesn't come from effort, but from arrangement. Maribel greeted Leah at the door with the same calm steadiness she had offered on the phone, and she led her through rooms that felt more like museums than places where people lived. Leah's footsteps sounded too loud on the floor, and she hated how quickly her mind tried to shrink her, reminding her she did not belong. Still, she kept walking, because there are moments when dignity is simply refusing to turn around. Richard Sterling met her in a quiet sitting room where the Christmas tree glowed softly, not ostentatious, just present, like a reminder that gentleness could exist even in a house built on power. He looked different without the restaurant's audience, less commanding, more tired, as if sleep had avoided him on purpose. Ben was there too, seated nearby with a book open in his lap, and when he saw Leah, his face brightened with such uncomplicated relief that it made something inside her loosen. Richard watched that expression, and Leah could tell he felt the weight of it, because children do not brighten for performance, they brighten for safety. He offered Leah a seat, and for a moment seemed to struggle with where to begin, as if he had spent his life negotiating deals, but had never learned how to apologize without protecting himself. Finally, he said he wanted the truth, no softened versions, no holiday misunderstanding, and he wanted it because his son had refused to let the matter die. So Leah told him. She spoke about the message that called her chosen, about how she showed up in her red uniform because she had been told to come as she was, and about how the laughter began before she even understood she was the punchline. She described the phones, the empty chair, the pizza placed in front of her like a cruel prop, and the manager's decision to make her the problem the moment the room felt uncomfortable. She said Cassandra Vale's name and watched Richard's face tighten, the way a man's face tightens when a familiar danger is spoken out loud in his own home. Then she said something she hadn't planned to say because the words were too honest to keep swallowing, that she wasn't asking to be saved, only to be treated like a person, and that last night proved how easily the wealthy forget that simple obligation. Richard listened without interrupting, Ben's small gaze steady on Leah as if he were silently urging the adults to do the right thing, and when Leah finished, she realized the silence that followed wasn't empty at all, because it was filled with the kind of decision that changes lives. Richard Sterling didn't respond right away, not because he hadn't heard Leah, but because her words landed in places he kept locked by habit. He leaned back as if distance could help him think, fingers steepled, eyes fixed on the small glow of the Christmas tree that suddenly looked less like decoration and more like a witness. Leah could tell he was replaying the restaurant scene with new understanding, seeing the prank not as social nonsense, but as something engineered, an act with a target, a purpose, and a name attached to it. When Cassandra Vale's name surfaced again in the silence, it did not feel like a person anymore. It felt like a door that should have stayed closed. And in that quiet, Leah sensed something she had feared all along. She hadn't been chosen at random. She had been chosen precisely. Maribel returned with tea no one touched, and with her came the first hard proof that the night had been planned like a show. She laid a tablet on the table with the careful discretion of someone who had spent years handling other people's secrets, and she explained that one of the younger staff members at the restaurant, shaken by what happened, had sent her screenshots from a private group chat used by the event's regular elite. Leah saw her own name typed like a joke, saw the words red uniform and pizza listed like props, and felt her stomach turn as if the humiliation were happening again in slow motion. There were laughing reactions, inside jokes, comments about teaching her a lesson, and a line that made Leah's mouth go dry. Make sure she thinks it's an honor. She'll show up. It wasn't just cruelty, it was certainty, the kind of certainty that comes from knowing someone's hopes well enough to weaponize them. Richard's face hardened as he scrolled, but what changed him most was not the mockery, it was the familiarity of the names. These weren't strangers, they were donors, friends, people who sat at his tables and called him a good man, while they laughed at the poor for sport. He paused on Cassandra's messages, and Leah could feel the air sharpen because Cassandra wasn't merely participating, she was directing, shaping the tone, nudging the group toward a particular outcome with elegant cruelty. Then Richard stopped at a single reaction, an approval that didn't belong to Cassandra at all, and his eyes narrowed as if he had been struck by an old memory. Leah watched him carefully, understanding that sometimes the most dangerous betrayal is not the one you expect from an enemy, but the one that arrives through someone who has always stood close enough to touch your life. Leah forced herself to speak, even though her voice wanted to retreat into caution, and she told Richard the part she had never said aloud, that Cassandra's name didn't only frighten her because of last night. Years ago, at a charity gala, Leah had been working service when she saw Cassandra in a service corridor with a woman crying and a man nearby arguing in a low, controlled voice. Leah had only caught fragments, threats wrapped in polite language, promises that sounded like cages, but the fear on that woman's face had stayed with her like a stain you can't wash out. Leah had walked away because she needed her job, because she didn't think anyone would believe her, and because poor people learn quickly what truth costs when it challenges the powerful. Now, looking at those screenshots, she realized Cassandra hadn't forgotten that night either, and perhaps this prank was not just entertainment, but insurance, a way of reminding Leah that she could still be reduced to nothing whenever Cassandra chose. Ben, who had been quiet until then, lifted his head from his book and stared at the screen with a seriousness that made Leah's heart ache. He didn't understand group chats or reputations, but he understood mean voices and unfairness, and he could feel the adults tightening around something heavy. Richard softened instantly at his son's expression and reached to close the tablet, as if protecting Ben from ugliness could undo it, but the boy spoke before the screen went dark. "Mum used to talk about her," Ben said simply, nodding toward Leah as if it were obvious, as if this were an old truth everyone else had strangely forgotten. The room went still in a new way, deeper, stranger, because Leah felt her own past shift beneath her feet, and Richard's face drained of certainty, as if a hidden thread had just snapped and revealed how tightly their lives had been tied all along. Richard Sterling did not shout after Ben's words, and he did not rush to rewrite the moment into something softer, because he knew that softness is often just a curtain pulled in front of rot. He simply sat very still, as if the room had become a chessboard, and the next move would determine whether truth would survive in his house. Leah felt the blood drain from her face, because Ben's sentence had reached back into a part of her life she kept sealed, the part that carried grief, unfinished promises, and the fear of being accused of inventing things she had only witnessed. Richard finally spoke to Maribel in a low voice, asking for names, timelines, receipts, anything that could stand upright under scrutiny, and the steadiness of his tone frightened Leah more than anger would have. It was the voice of a man who had decided that the only way out was through. By evening, Richard's home looked prepared for celebration, but the energy beneath the decorations felt like a storm wearing a ribbon. A holiday gathering had been scheduled, elegant, well-attended, perfectly photographed, exactly the kind of event where Cassandra Vale and her circle thrived, and exactly the kind of event where appearances usually swallowed truth whole. Leah arrived quietly, guided by Maribel, and she almost turned back when she saw the chandelier-lit room filling with tailored coats, perfume, laughter, and the easy confidence of people who believed they would never be held accountable. Richard had insisted she come not as staff and not as a symbol, but as a witness, and that request alone made Leah's spine straighten with a new kind of resolve. Ben stayed close, his small hand occasionally brushing hers, as if reminding her she wasn't alone, and Leah realized that whatever happened next would be watched not only by the wealthy, but by a child who still believed right and wrong were real. Cassandra entered as if she owned the air, her smile composed, her eyes scanning the room with practiced control until they found Leah, and then, for a fraction of a second, the warmth in her expression went thin. She recovered instantly, gliding toward Richard with holiday charm, congratulating him on the lovely gathering, offering compliments like coins meant to buy comfort. When her gaze returned to Leah, it carried that same polite cruelty Leah remembered from years ago, the kind that says, without words, "You are still small, and I can still make you smaller." Cassandra leaned in just enough to be heard by Leah alone and murmured something sweet about miscommunications and opportunities, the kind of language that pretends to lift you while warning you not to stand too tall. Leah did not respond. She simply held her posture because she understood that dignity, once taken back, must be guarded like fire in wind. Richard waited until the room had settled into its familiar rhythm. Glasses raised, soft music, the false safety of tradition. Then he asked for everyone's attention with a calm that made the chatter die obediently. He spoke about kindness as if it were a value his family honored, and several guests nodded, relieved to be praised in advance, until his tone shifted and he mentioned last night's entertainment at the restaurant. The room tightened. Smiles paused mid-curve. Cassandra's expression stayed pleasant, but her eyes sharpened. Richard did not accuse at first. He presented the way a man presents figures in a ledger, screenshots, timestamps, names, messages that turned holiday fun into an organized act of humiliation, and the air grew colder with each line of proof. Then he played a short clip from a phone video, the moment Leah sat alone with the empty chair facing her, and the sound of laughter in the recording made the guests flinch, as if they'd been caught hearing their own ugliness out loud. Excuses came quickly, as they always do when the powerful are confronted. Misunderstandings, jokes taken too seriously, intentions twisted by sensitivity, and finally, the oldest defense of all: she shouldn't have been there. Cassandra stepped forward with perfect composure and tried to turn the room against Leah, implying she was manipulating the situation for attention, implying she had a past, implying she was dangerous in ways that required no evidence to suggest. But Ben's voice, small and steady, broke through the polished lies, as he said he had seen Leah being laughed at, and he didn't understand why grown-ups were allowed to be cruel and still call themselves good. Richard looked at his son, and something settled in his face, as if the last remaining doubt had finally left him. He turned back to the room and said quietly that anyone who could mock a working woman on Christmas Eve was no longer welcome in his life or under his name. And as Cassandra's smile began to fracture at the edges, Leah felt the gathering tilt toward something irreversible, because the next thing Cassandra chose to do would reveal whether she feared truth or whether she planned to destroy it. Cassandra Vale did not explode. She smiled, because some people have learned to weaponize calm the way others weaponize rage. She spoke with measured disappointment, as if Richard were the one embarrassing the room, as if accountability were an unfortunate breach of etiquette. She reminded everyone of donations, connections, favors exchanged in private hallways, and she implied, without saying it outright, that a man like Richard Sterling did not owe the truth to a waitress in a red uniform. Then she turned her gaze toward Leah with a sweetness that felt sharpened, suggesting Leah had misread the situation, that she was clinging to attention, that she was dangerous to the peace of respectable people. It was a familiar tactic. If you cannot deny the cruelty, discredit the person who survived it. And for a moment, the room hovered between two futures, one where the powerful protected their own, and one where they finally admitted what they had become. Richard did not respond with insults, because he understood something Cassandra had spent her life exploiting. Loud fights entertain, but quiet decisions change the world. He looked around the gathering at faces that had laughed last night and now pretended they were merely concerned, and he asked one question in a tone so even it sounded like gravity. What kind of person records humiliation on Christmas Eve and calls it fun? No one answered, because the answer was sitting in their hands, in their phones, in the evidence they had created for themselves. Richard then did what his circle feared most. He removed the safety net of influence, explaining that his foundation would cut ties with any organization connected to the prank, that professional contracts would be reviewed, and that anyone involved would be barred from his home and his business circles. It wasn't a theatrical punishment. It was a refusal to keep paying the social price of protecting cruelty. And in that moment, the room began to understand that the man they thought they knew was choosing a different kind of power. The manager from the restaurant, pale and sweating, tried to speak, tried to place blame on staff, on misunderstandings, on Leah's emotions, but Richard's gaze stopped him the way a locked door stops a thief. Richard stated plainly that Leah would receive formal documentation clearing her name, that the restaurant would be required to acknowledge its role, and that the staff member who forwarded the screenshots would be protected, not punished. He wasn't performing benevolence. He was repairing damage with the seriousness of a man who had finally recognized that reputation without character is just expensive costume jewelry. Cassandra's smile thinned as she realized she could no longer steer him with social pressure. Leah watched it all with a strange, trembling calm, because the most shocking part wasn't seeing the powerful lose control. It was seeing someone with control choose decency when it cost him comfort, and for the first time since she'd sat at that empty chair, she felt something inside her stop apologizing. Ben stepped forward before anyone could stop him, as if his body understood what his heart had been waiting for all along. He crossed the room and wrapped his arms around Leah's waist with the natural trust of a child claiming what feels safe. And the gesture cracked something open in the gathering that no speech could touch. Leah froze at first, then lowered her hands to his shoulders, careful and gentle, because she understood how delicate this moment was, how easily adults could poison it with suspicion or cynicism. Richard watched his son hold on to Leah and looked, for a brief second, like a man who had just seen the kind of love he never learned how to earn. He didn't ask Ben to let go. He didn't redirect the scene. He let it stand, because he recognized that his son's affection was not a scandal, it was a compass. And the room, forced to witness innocence choosing kindness, finally lost its appetite for cruelty. When the guests began to leave, the night drained of its glamour and revealed what it really was, a turning point wrapped in holiday lights. Leah expected to feel victorious, but what she felt was quieter, relief, disbelief, and a grief she hadn't anticipated for the years she had spent shrinking to survive. Richard approached her afterward, not with the posture of a savior, but with the careful seriousness of a man trying to become worthy of his own child's values. He told Leah he would make things right publicly, not because it looked good, but because hiding truth was the original sin of last night, and he was done practicing that religion. Leah nodded, unsure what words could fit a moment like this, and as Ben slipped his small hand into hers again, she felt a new kind of fear rise, because justice was one thing, but healing was another. And as Richard asked softly whether she would be willing to talk privately about Ben's mother and what Ben meant when he said she used to speak about Leah, Leah realized the hardest truth was still waiting, one that could either knit their lives together or tear open an old wound that money had tried to bury. In the days that followed the gathering, Leah's life did not transform with fireworks, but with quiet corrections that felt almost unfamiliar, as if the universe were finally admitting it had misfiled her under disposable. Richard moved with an efficiency that did not seek applause, issuing formal statements that cleared her name, documenting the restaurant's misconduct, and ensuring she received compensation that covered the wages she'd lost and the damage that had been done to her reputation. Maribel helped Leah navigate the practical details: letters, references, a new position at a smaller, reputable place where respect was not a reward, but a baseline. Yet Leah noticed that the greatest shift wasn't financial at all. It was the way people suddenly listened to her without smirking, as if one powerful man's decision had forced the world to remember she had always been human. Even so, Leah remained careful, because she had learned that kindness can be genuine and still come with consequences. Richard, meanwhile, changed in ways that did not look dramatic from the outside, but felt profound in the spaces between words. He stopped speaking about image and started speaking about example, especially when Ben was in the room, as if fatherhood had become a mirror he could no longer avoid. He didn't flirt with Leah's gratitude or frame her as a charity project. Instead, he asked what she needed to feel safe, what boundaries she wanted, what repairs would actually matter. Leah found herself answering honestly, and the honesty startled her because she was used to needing permission to say what she felt. Ben remained the simplest part of it all, drifting into Leah's presence like warmth, showing her drawings, asking questions that didn't hurt, laughing in a way that made the house seem less like a monument and more like a home. Leah began to realize that healing often starts with something small, a child treating you as if your worth is not up for debate. It was on a quiet afternoon, with snow tapping softly against the windows, that the truth about Ben's mother finally stopped circling and stepped into the room. Richard brought out an old photo album, his hands slower than usual, and Ben climbed onto the sofa beside Leah as if he already knew the story mattered. The woman in the pictures had a gentle face and tired eyes that looked familiar to Leah in the way some strangers feel familiar, like you've shared a hallway of life even if you didn't share a name. Her name was Evelyn, Richard said, and his voice lowered, not in performance, but in grief that still lived close to his throat. Leah felt her chest tighten, because the name didn't arrive as new information. It arrived like the missing piece of a memory she'd been afraid to assemble. Leah told Richard the truth she had carried like a sealed envelope. Years ago, before Evelyn became a Sterling by marriage, and before the world knew how to say her last name with reverence, she had volunteered quietly at a community outreach kitchen where Leah worked weekends to make ends meet. Evelyn had come without cameras, without announcements, without the hunger to be praised, and she had treated the staff the way she treated the people they served, with calm respect, with eye contact, with patience. One night, in a service corridor at a gala, Leah had seen Evelyn crying while Cassandra Vale spoke to her in that sweet, controlled tone that leaves bruises you can't photograph. And Evelyn had clutched Leah's hand afterward, as if Leah were the only solid thing left in the building. Evelyn had whispered that she was scared of what money could cover up, scared of what would happen if she ever told the truth about the people around Richard. Leah had tried, once, to send a letter to Richard's foundation after Evelyn died, not to accuse, only to warn, but the letter had vanished into silence, and Leah had assumed the world had decided her voice didn't count. Richard sat back as if the air had been knocked from him, because the disappearance of that letter was not an accident. It was a pattern, and he could suddenly see Cassandra's fingerprints on the years he thought were simply tragic. Ben, listening with wide eyes, reached into a small box Maribel had brought from storage and pulled out a handmade ornament, paper and ribbon imperfect and precious, then held it up to Leah as if it belonged to her. Leah recognized it instantly because Evelyn had made it during a volunteer night, laughing softly as she tied the ribbon, saying that the best things were the ones made with ordinary hands. Richard stared at the ornament, then at Leah, and something in his expression broke open into understanding that was both tender and terrible. And when he asked, quietly, almost reverently, if Leah would spend Christmas Day with them, not as staff and not as a symbol, but as someone Evelyn trusted, Leah felt her courage waver, because accepting that invitation meant stepping into a family that could heal her, or reminding her all over again how easy it is to be left outside. Christmas morning did not feel like a reward, and it did not feel like a fairy tale. It felt like a quiet door opening after years of being told to wait outside. Leah arrived with her hands tucked into her coat pockets, carrying nothing but Evelyn's handmade ornament wrapped carefully in tissue, because she had learned that the most precious things are often the simplest. The Sterling house was warm in a way the restaurant never was, not because of chandeliers or polished wood, but because the people inside were finally trying to be honest. Ben met her at the doorway with bright, impatient joy, as if the world had been holding its breath until she returned, and he pulled her in without asking permission, from pride. Leah felt her throat tighten, not from humiliation this time, but from the unfamiliar ache of being welcomed without conditions. Richard stood back at first, watching the scene the way a man watches something he doesn't deserve, but hopes he can become worthy of. He didn't try to erase the distance with gifts or grand gestures. He offered her a simple "good morning" and a seat at the table, as if that seat were not charity, but a fact. In the soft clatter of breakfast plates and the low murmur of holiday music, he spoke to Leah about what he had done after the gathering: contracts severed, donors removed, formal apologies filed, and a public statement that named the cruelty for what it was. Cassandra Vale, he admitted, would not be punished with spectacle because spectacle was her language. She would be punished with exclusion and exposure, the slow consequence of people no longer trusting her polished smile. Leah listened, feeling an old instinct whisper that power always finds a way to protect itself, yet she could see that Richard was no longer trying to protect the world that had raised him. He was protecting the world his son still believed could exist. Later, Ben insisted on hanging Evelyn's ornament on the tree, and he chose a branch at eye level, as if he wanted it seen rather than hidden among prettier things. Leah watched the ribbon sway gently, and memory rose in her like warm steam. Evelyn laughing in a community kitchen, Evelyn speaking softly about courage, Evelyn squeezing Leah's hand in that service corridor as if begging her not to forget the truth. Richard's eyes stayed on the ornament longer than he meant them to, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a confession he had avoided for years. He had been surrounded by people who called themselves loyal while they filtered reality, and Evelyn had been alone in her honesty. Leah told him quietly that Evelyn's goodness hadn't been fragile, it had been deliberate, and that the only way to honor someone like that was to live in a way that doesn't require lies. Ben, listening without fully understanding, only understood enough to nod, as if the words matched something he already felt. After breakfast, Richard asked Leah what she wanted, not for show, but for her life, and the question startled her more than any apology. She thought of her apartment's thin walls, her uncertain future, her long habit of settling for less because asking felt dangerous, and she realized that the greatest wound poverty leaves is the belief that you should be grateful for crumbs. Leah answered slowly, choosing truth over pride. She wanted stability, she wanted work where she wasn't treated like a joke, and she wanted to stop feeling ashamed for existing in rooms she cleaned and served. Richard didn't promise to fix her because fixing was not what she needed. He offered resources, introductions, and time, and he made it clear that she could say no at any point without punishment. In that steadiness, Leah felt something begin to heal, not because a billionaire had noticed her, but because a man with power had finally learned that dignity is not something you grant, it is something you protect. That afternoon, as snow drifted outside like a softer kind of silence, Leah stood by the tree one more time and watched Ben admiring the ornament as if it were the most important thing in the room. She understood then that the true turning point had never been the prank itself, but the moment a child refused to laugh at suffering and forced the adults to meet their own character. Money could build beautiful rooms, but it could not build a conscience that had to be chosen one decision at a time, especially when no one benefits except the vulnerable. Leah didn't know what her future would look like in exact detail, yet for the first time in a long time, she could imagine it without flinching because she had stepped into a life where her worth wasn't debated. If this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption.